I sharpened my pencil till the end snapped off, and the graphite crumbled in my hands. It didn't take me long to learn to write my own name, but it was years before I could claim to know who it was glued to. See, I knew that I didn't really belong to this place. Not really. My mum's distant ancestors came here from England or Scotland or somewhere, and Dad, his dark skin spoke louder than a passport, so of course he was always labelled a foreigner. When people asked me where I was from, honest answers like Brisbane or Chermside didn't seem to satisfy, didn't sufficiently explain my differentness. Pauline Hanson popped up, spouting dinky-die old-school racism, and people actually voted for her. Meanwhile, here's 10-year-old me watching her on TV, born here, raised here, grazed here. Never even occurred to me that my legitimacy as an Australian might be under question, primarily because my skin isn't sufficiently susceptible to sunburn. I sharpened my pencil till the end snapped off, trying to triangulate home, but not quite sure where the satellites were, like a mobile phone with bad reception, not lost, just disconnected. I'd imbibed society's subtle yet firm insistences that different equals wrong and brown equals different. How else do you behave when the people of your birthplace treat you like an outsider? I trimmed back my hairy caterpillar eyebrows, secretly envied the small noses and thin lips of Caucasian classmates, kept sharpening that pencil. Dad was so busy trying to fit in, he didn't even teach me his language, and now, years later, I can only scavenge small morsels of vocabulary, like a crow searching for scattered crumbs. I hate the Australian flag, redundant relic of colonialism. In my mind's uncharted subterranean mazes, it's somehow connected to the impossible decision of whether I shade my face in or leave it white. Terrorist jokes are still the number one reason not to grow a beard. But I grow one out of spite, and also because I'm too lazy to shave. I suppose it made me stronger in the end. Nowadays, I don't sharpen my pencil nearly as often, and no one tells me what to write. Thank you. In 2005, after thousands of drunk white Australians rioted through Cronulla, beating up brown-skinned people and chanting the words, "Fuck off, Lebs," Prime Minister John Howard told journalists, "I do not accept that there is underlying racism in this country. I do not believe Australians are racist." No matter how journalists rephrased their questions, Howard continually denied that racism was a key factor in the Cronulla riots, and in many respects, this is exactly what most voters wanted him to do. Australians need to recognise the systemic nature of racism. Systemic racism isn't as overt and blatant as the Cronulla riots or the booing of Adam Goodes, but it's there in the over-incarceration of First Nations peoples, in the exploitation of migrant workers, in the persecution of Muslim Australians, in the demonisation of asylum seekers. Unfortunately, most Aussies don't want to talk about it. This reluctance is deeply ingrained in our culture and prevents us from seeing the link between individual bigotry and systemic oppression. It blinds us. It shackles us, it deafens us, it ties our shoelaces together, and we will remain shackled until we recognise that our political, economic and legal systems are not objective or values neutral. They are racialised systems which covertly privilege whiteness while rendering whiteness invisible. Now, to clarify, I'm definitely not suggesting that white people are invisible. Some of my best friends are white. But what most of them don't see, what many of us don't see, is that racism continues to shape our society in such a way that most white Australians aren't even aware of their own privilege. So what is racism? Let's start by thinking about how individual instances of obvious overt racism are dealt with in public discourse. You know the pattern. A video emerges of some bigot, often drunk, racially abusing a fellow passenger on public transport. Suddenly, social media goes into overdrive. Everyone's outraged. What an awful person. And we participate in a collective purification ritual of public shaming and self-absolution, seeking to reassure ourselves that that person is a rare aberration. That's what a racist looks like. That's not me. We're not racist people. We're not a racist nation. Too few of us make the link between the actions of that racist individual and the socio-political systems that have shaped and to some extent legitimised that person's behaviour. Many Australians tend to define racism too narrowly. We're taught to think of racism as being a strong dislike or hatred of people from another ethnic group. But the narrowness of that definition masks the important connection to systemic racism. It blinds us to the fact that we really should be looking at the practical results and outcomes of a person's actions instead of asking, did a person intend to be racist? If a government officer from Child Services removes an Aboriginal boy from their parents, we're never going to be able to know for sure whether that decision was motivated partly by racial prejudice. But when we look at the nationwide statistics and see that even today in Australia, Aboriginal children are 8 times more likely to be removed from their parents than non-Indigenous children, it's clear that on some level, our economic, legal and political systems are oppressing Aboriginal families. Instead of asking, did a person intend to be racist, we should ask, were the practical outcomes of their behaviour racially oppressive? Racism is more accurately defined as the oppression of a racial other, backed up by social or institutional power. So who is the racial other in Australia? This is complex. We know race can't be defined according to genetics alone. So race is really about arbitrary, socially constructed distinctions in culture, religion, and collective group identity. As Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, race is the child of racism, not the father. The boundaries between in-group and out-group shift according to the whims of social and economic power holders. The lines are blurry. Sometimes the racial other is Indigenous peoples. Sometimes it's Muslims. All this is not to say that people of colour don't sometimes oppress each other or that fair-skinned peoples have never experienced oppression. But in Australia, the complex interplay of relationships between people of different nationalities, cultures and religions operate against a backdrop of normalised whiteness, where outsider is the default status for people who don't present as white. I am presumed to be an outsider until I prove otherwise. So what is normalised whiteness? This is an interesting example. News.com released this as an interactive website on Australia Day last year. It's called the Australianator. The idea is to mix and match the body parts of famous Australians to build the ultimate Aussie. Obviously a ridiculous premise, but what I find most striking is that all 36 iconic Australians present as fair-skinned. There's no Adam Goodes, Kathy Freeman, Lee Lin Chin, Wally Ali, Ernie Dingo. Now, mainstream cultural products like this continually reinforce the white Australian narrative. With a few notable exceptions, our celebrities and media personalities are white. Our political leaders are white. Even Blinky Bill sounds like a white guy. He must have been one of those colonial koalas that came over on the First Fleet. Whiteness is normal. Whiteness is the default. Australia's collective national identity is still based upon an unspoken, underlying distinction between white Australia and the racial other. This is a problem because it increases the chances of Australians dehumanising people of colour, such as migrant workers, Indigenous peoples, and refugees. Let's be honest with ourselves. Towing boats back to Indonesia isn't about saving lives at sea. It's about keeping out the racial other. Australians feel deeply, irrationally, hypocritically threatened by the idea that people of colour might migrate here without first seeking our permission, so we employ the rhetoric of national security to justify our dehumanisation of the racial other. Systemic racism is everywhere. In 2013, researchers in Brizzy found that white bus passengers who said they didn't have enough money for a ticket were significantly more likely to be given a free ride than would-be passengers of Indian or African ancestry. In 2009, researchers at ANU found that job applicants with Middle Eastern or Chinese-sounding names were significantly less likely to be called in for interviews than job applicants with identical resumes but Anglo-sounding names. But the one that worries me the most is that right now, in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are 15 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-Indigenous Australians. 15 times. Now remember what I said earlier about results versus intentions. We shouldn't get too caught up wondering whether individual police officers or judges are racist. We look at the results and outcomes of the system as a whole. And no matter which way you try to spin it, a system that locks up black people at far higher rates than white people is a racist system. But systemic racism goes deeper than that. It's not just that Indigenous people are over-incarcerated, it's that we rarely talk about it. It's that political responses are paternalistic tokenism. It's that we don't listen when Aboriginal people themselves offer critiques and solutions to these problems, but we don't call that racism, because our idea of racism has been redefined and reduced to the bigot on the bus. In 1901, Australia's first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, told Parliament, "There is no racial equality. there is basic inequality. These races are, in comparison to white races, unequal and inferior. Now, I know some of you are thinking, oh, that was 100 years ago. Australia is different now. But the past shapes the present. Our legal and political and economic systems were designed by white supremacists. And that past influences present-day political thinking. In recent years, we've seen our political leaders adopt ambiguous catchphrases like Team Australia and Judeo-Christian values. This is coded language for the same racist sentiments that underpin the White Australia project, that people who depart noticeably from the white Australian benchmark aren't worthy of belonging to our society. Instead of understanding Reclaim Australia as a fringe, extreme movement, we need to recognise that such movements exist along a continuum with mainstream systemic racism. The fundamental premise of Reclaim Australia, that some cultures don't belong here and that only true Australians can decide which is which, is fundamentally racist. So why are our political leaders so reluctant to acknowledge the connection between that overt racism and the underlying systemic racism? It's because in 21st century Australia, discussing the systemic nature of racism remains taboo. We don't mind talking about the bigot on the bus or about racism in other countries, but it goes against Australian culture to talk openly about mainstream Australian racism. This taboo is passed on from one generation to the next and is also internalised by most migrants who come to this country seeking to integrate. Newcomers quickly learn that part of fitting in means not talking about racism. Because when you tell white Australians that they benefit from an inherently racist system, the most common defence is denial. Sociologists have a term for this. They call it white fragility. And white fragility is a real problem. Most white Australians, maybe most white people around the world, are so unaccustomed to having their perspective on race questioned that even slight challenges to that worldview can be deeply confronting and stressful. When a person of colour violates this social taboo, they're immediately subjected to harsh public criticism. People of colour who talk about racism are accused of playing the race card, digging up the past, or being unnecessarily divisive. Look at our treatment of Adam Goodes. Nothing he says is particularly radical, but he makes non-Indigenous Australians nervous because he dares to remind them of their own privilege. One of the most striking aspects of the recent I Stand With Adam campaign was how quickly it refocused public attention on overt, obvious racism and marginalised discussion of systemic racism. Where's the national Twitter campaign for Aboriginal deaths in custody? Of all the cultural myths that undermine free discussion of racism, one of the deepest is that Australia is a meritocratic society, that if you work hard, you'll rise to the top. This bullshit narrative ignores the fact that people of colour face many additional structural barriers that most white Australians aren't even aware of. For example, underpaid migrant workers are a crucial component of our economy. They drive our taxis, they harvest our food, and they serve us at the 7-Eleven. But they risk deportation if they stand up for their basic work rights. By denying them citizenship, our system ensures that no matter how hard they work, most of them will never climb the ladder. The meritocracy is a fiction. We retell it so we don't have to feel guilty about the people left at the bottom. This myth of a meritocratic society feeds into the notion of race blindness, also known as colour blindness, the flawed ideology that you can fight racism simply by acting as though race doesn't exist. Now, not only is it deeply naive to assume that people aren't also going to be influenced subconsciously by cultural and media stereotypes, but acting as though race suddenly isn't a thing doesn't undo hundreds of years of oppression and exploitation. It's not going to stop Aboriginal people being incarcerated or Muslim women being spat on in the street. Acknowledging systemic racism will make most of us a little uncomfortable, but it need not leave us feeling guilty or powerless. Being white isn't a crime, and being a person of colour doesn't automatically give you the moral high ground on every issue. The challenge is for all of us to think critically about the systems that shape our lives and to recognise that simply retweeting feel-good anti-racist slogans isn't going to cut it. We need to talk about radical structural reform. Australia's racism isn't just in the past. It's pervasive, systemic, and ongoing. The bigot on the bus is just the tip of the iceberg. Reclaim Australia is a symptom of a deeper problem. But pretending that race is irrelevant isn't going to make racism go away.